Okay, folks at home, somebody tell me, can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Thank you. Okay. How did those get here? All right. If any of you haven't picked up an exam, I've got exams still hauling around, like over half of them. Really like to give them back. Name?
My exam.
What's your name?
Garcia Jack.
Okay. Exams, yes or no? Okay. Well, that's a pretty good score for this exam. All right, well, for the rest of you who have not picked up your exams, please make an effort to do that. All you're doing is hurting my shoulder, and I don't want to be doing this the rest of the semester. Okay, so today we will start talking about mutualisms, which is the last of our pairwise species interactions. And this material will not appear on the exam on Monday. So we stopped with that material on Wednesday when we talked about herbivores. So we had 5 lectures, more or less, about exploitation. We had the basic exploitation in nature. We developed the models. We looked at evolution. We looked at 2 special cases, parasites and herbivores. Okay. Whoops, I guess I'd better mute that. And we had 3 lectures on competition in nature, develop the models, and then competition evolution. And the last thing on this exam was the very first one, which was the matrix stuff. Okay, so matrix, 3 competition topics, 5 exploitation topics. That's what's on Monday's exam. This will not be on that exam. This will be on the 4th exam. So today we'll talk about what is actually my favorite set of interactions in nature, which is mutualism. And today we'll focus on mutualisms in nature and how they're structured and what kind of characteristics evolve in mutualistic interactions. And then on Wednesday, after the exam, we'll come back and look at some topics about evolution of mutualisms. So we will look first at some terms that are very frequently used as synonyms. They are not synonyms. They have specific meanings. And I do not use one when I mean the other. Okay, and that's mutualism, coevolution, and symbiosis. And then we'll look at the specific types of mutualisms that are really, really common in nature. And that's energy resource mutualisms, pollination, dispersal, and protection mutualisms. Okay, so in a mutualism, both participating species gain a benefit from the presence of the other. What that means is that if a mutualistic partner is present, your carrying capacity is increased. Now, there is some theory and some equations that have been developed to describe these, but in practice, ecologists don't use them very much. They don't use them in anywhere near the ways that they use the competition equations or the predation equations. They don't draw graphs in the same way. So we won't be emphasizing those things. Two of the three types of two species interactions make use of more mathematics and more graphs than the other one. So mutualism gets us out of this, and we're back to a more narrative kind of description of these interactions. So little or no math here, and really not much in the way of graphs, at least not in the kinds of graphs that we've been doing. All right, well, first let's be clear about what our terms really are. So a mutualism refers to a two species interaction in which the partners benefit. That is, the carrying capacities are higher in the presence of the other species than they are in the absence. Now, I just said two species interactions because that's the simplest way to think about it. But in fact, many mutualisms are multi-species interactions where a multitude of species contribute to greater carrying capacities of one another. Now, most mutualisms are what we call facultative. And in a facultative mutualism, the partners benefit from one another, but they don't require the presence of the other in order to survive. Okay. The other kind of mutualism, which is much more infrequent in nature, is an obligate mutualism, in which partners have an absolute requirement for each other in order to survive and reproduce. Now, if you give it a moment's thought, you can clearly see why facultative mutualisms are expected to be much more common in nature. That's because obligate mutualisms are basically an evolutionary trap. If you become so reliant on another species that you require it for your survival or reproduction, what happens when it goes away? Well, you go extinct. So it's actually quite easy for obligate mutualisms to go extinct, and they are frequently seen as an evolutionary dead end for that reason. So you get into one of these really spectacular obligate mutualisms. Yeah, it's spectacular, but it's also pretty lethal, because if anything were to happen to one or the other partner, you'd both go extinct. So for that reason, facultative mutualisms just tend to last a lot longer. If you benefit from, but don't require another species, then you can hang on, you can do reasonably well in the absence of your mutualist. And if it does show up, well, great, you get a benefit. But it's not a death sentence if that mutualist is not present. So facultative mutualisms are really the rule in nature. Obligate mutualisms are extremely rare. And there are some mutualisms that we have thought up until recently were obligate, that turn out to be not obligate, or they're obligate for one of the partners, but not for the other. It's also possible to have an asymmetrical relationship. Like one of the partners does, in fact, require the other for survival and reproduction, but the partner does not require the other one, and it merely benefits. So facultative mutualisms are very, very common in nature. They are far more common than we realized even 30, 40 years ago. And many, excuse me, many of the phenomena that we see today are based on mutualistic interactions. We used to think back in the mid 20th century that it was all competition and predation. But in fact, the more we look, the more we see mutualisms at the root of a lot of interactions. Really excellent example is mitochondria. Mitochondria are mutualists that live within the cells of metazoans. Cells did not originally have mitochondria, but it's a mutually beneficial arrangement that probably originated about 3.5 billion years ago. You had these little cell-like structures that were extremely good at energy transformations, and yet they were limited by the availability of raw materials. Well, much bigger cells, which were limited by their ability to acquire energy, could acquire the building blocks that mitochondria needed to do their jobs. So when a cell ate a mitochondrion but then failed to digest it, modern metazoans were born. Okay, let's talk about symbiosis here while we're talking about terms. Symbiosis is often used interchangeably with mutualism. It is not. I will absolutely take a red pencil to your exam and scrawl all over it if you make that mistake. They are not synonyms. Okay, symbiosis is an interaction in which partners live in close proximity. Sometimes they actually live together or one lives within another. That is not necessarily mutualistic. Most mutualisms are not symbiotic at all. Pollination mutualisms are not symbiotic. Bees and other insects do not live together with plants. Most mutualisms are facultative, whereas symbiosis more or less implies that this is a obligate relationship for at least one of the partners. And finally, most damning of all, most symbioses are parasitic. Somebody lives within or on another species and causes it harm. That's what most symbioses are. So the symbiosis between the malaria parasite and humans is, in fact, the proper way to use the term symbiosis, but there's no way that's a mutualism. The parasite lives on or in the host, so it is symbiotic. So be careful how you use these terms. There's a lot of very loose language out there, and people simply assume that symbiosis means mutualism. It does not. All right, let's look at the major mutualisms that we find in nature. There are 4 that are exceedingly common. The first is energy-nutrient mutualisms. One partner provides protection, the other provides a limiting resource. Or each partner provides the other with a limiting but complementary resource. That's the kind of mutualism that metazoan cells and mitochondria have. Mitochondria provide the cells with energy, and the cells provide the mitochondria with the machinery in order to carry out that energy transformation. Okay, so this is really This is really, really, really diverse. And we will look at it only one or two examples of this. Second major one is pollination, in which the plant provides resources, typically energy, and the pollinator provides reproductive services. So the pollinator serves as a third partner transferring gametes. Dispersal mutualisms are rather similar. Once again, the plant provides some kind of resource, but the disperser puts seeds into favorable environments for the next generation of those plants. And finally, protection mutualisms involve one species providing a service and the other protects it from being exploited. So you might provide a place to live in exchange for another species, more or less keeping your predators away from you. So we'll have examples of all of these today. And here is a typical energy nutrient mutualism. And this is the example of mycorrhizal fungi that live on the roots of plants. There are two types. There are endomycorrhizae and there are ectomycorrhizae. And the difference depends on whether the fungus actually penetrates into the plant cells in the roots. Ectomycorrhizae have their hyphae, their fungal hyphae, growing sort of in the interstices between plant root cells. So they don't actually penetrate those cells. Okay, and here on the left is an example of an ectomycorrhizal fungus. And so you can see the cell here is outlined by the fungal hyphae in white, but the fungus does not actually penetrate that cell. The hyphae are growing sort of in between the cells. Okay, here's an endomycorrhizal. Wait, I've got them backwards. How'd that happen? This is endo. Okay, and right here, there you go, there you go. That's it right there. Okay, you see this cell here, and you see the hyphae sort of winding their way between the cells, but right here, they're penetrating into the cell itself. And they're, again, sort of meandering around the cells, but right here, they're penetrating into the cells, penetrating the cells. So they're directly exchanging material with the cell cytoplasm inside the cell itself. There's this diffusion across the hyphal membrane into the protoplasm of the cell. In the ectomycorrhizae, the cells are never penetrated. And here you can see they never go inside. They just sort of wander around the interstices of the cells. And so there's an extra small distance that diffusion has to occur. It has to occur through the cell wall and through the cell membrane also. So that leads to maybe extra energy being required for some of this exchange. Whereas if you actually penetrate into the interior of the cell, it's quite easy for just simple diffusion to effectively cause the transfer of materials from one species to another. But the thing is that virtually all plants on Earth have fungal associates. And without those fungal associates, their growth is stunted. They are very bad at absorbing nutrients and water from soil. This is one of the most ancient energy nutrient mutualisms there is. Plants and fungi teamed up together very, very soon after plants colonized land. And the success of terrestrial plants is largely due to their ability to form these associations with fungi. Whoops, and actually I did want to say a little more. And I used to have a graph, I used to have a figure showing you what the relative growth rate of plants was like with and without mycorrhizal fungi. Basically, you can take the soil and sterilize it so that there's no fungus in it. And you can take a seed of a plant and you can wash it with dilute bleach to kill all the fungus on the surface of the seed. So you can plant a sterile seed in sterile soil. And you can compare the growth of the plant that emerges to a seed that has not been sterilized, that's been planted in soil that contains lots of fungus. There's no comparison. The soil that contains fungus and the plant that is able to establish a mutualism with the fungus in the soil grows vastly faster and vastly bigger. We would not be able to maintain food production without healthy mycorrhizal associates. Now, another such mutualism that is really popular to talk about in this class is, of course, lichens. Lichens are a combination of a blue-green alga and a fungus. The fungus provides more or less the structure of the lichen, and the algae grow in that structure and they synthesize, providing the fungus with energy. And of course, the fungus then absorbs nutrients from the substrate and passes them on to the alga. And that's pretty much the same thing that's going on here. What's happening is these roots are connected to leaves, and the leaves are photosynthesizing. That is not something that fungi can do. So in this situation, the fungus is getting energy in the form of glucose from the plant and is providing the plant with extra rations of nutrients and sometimes water, which it is much easier to absorb into these tiny hyphae. You can see the diameter of this hypha is much, much smaller than the diameter of this even tiny plant root. That means that the surface area through which absorption of soil, nutrients, and water can occur is hugely greater if you've got a fungus associated with your root. And that's the advantage that these plants have. They basically can make use of this, this network of tiny, tiny hyphae with absolutely enormous surface area for absorption, far more than the surface area that they could attain from even the finest roots. So that's the advantage. That's what plants get out of this. They get extra nutrients and water because of the hugely greater surface area of the fungal hyphae. Okay, there are many, many, many such mutualisms, but it's important to understand that our very existence depends on them. We would not be able to grow agricultural crops in nearly the amounts that are required to support us without this kind of symbiosis. All right, now let's move on to talk about the second major one, which is pollination, which is much more obvious to us because who doesn't like flowers and who doesn't like butterflies, right? So basically, flowers and insects especially have this relationship. They co-evolved together back at the end Jurassic times and early Cretaceous. That is when flowering plants became the dominant forms of plant life on land. And that is also when insects had an explosive radiation into the groups that we see today. The reason that we have so many insects is because they served as pollinators for the original angiosperms. The angiosperms diversified because of the services insects provided, and every time that happened, more and more insect species could be supported. Okay, but as it turns out, it's not enough just to have a flower. You have to have some sort of specificity for pollination to work well. You just put out some pollen out there. Well, okay, who's gonna find it? Well, it could be a predator. Okay, it could be an animal that will not ever come in contact with another flower of your same species, in which case that's wasted effort. So insects select the traits of flowers, and flowers select traits on insects. And this coevolution then results in a fairly tight match between the characteristics of flowers that are trying to attract certain insects and the characteristics of the insects that visit them. So here is a summary of the kinds of traits that flowers have evolved in order to attract particular pollinators. So we call this a pollination syndrome. If a plant is trying to attract bats, well, bats are mammals, they're nocturnal mammals, and the flowers that these plants have to bear in order to successfully attract bats have to appeal to the sensory abilities of these bats, the timing of their activity, and they have to have a suitable reward. So the color of bat pollinated flowers tends to be white, purple, or green. Why is that? Because they're nocturnal. Okay, so white makes sense. Why do purple and green make sense? Because a lot of mammals don't use their eyes, they use their nose. So you can have a green or purple flower that has a really strong scent, and the bats will still find it. Okay, the shape cannot be too complicated because you're just trying to get a bat to stick his head in the flower, get covered with pollen. And so these are night open, and they're regular and bowl shaped, not too complicated. And the nectar has to be way down in the bottom to get that bat to stick his head way in as far as possible and get dusted with pollen all over. When it visits the next flower, some of that pollen will be brushed off onto the stamens. If you're looking for insects, you need very different characteristics. So bee flowers tend to be colors that bees see well. White, yellow, and blue are the predominant ones. They do have an odor because bees have a keen sense of smell. They often have a little landing platform. They're much smaller than bat flowers because bees are much smaller. But they're often tubular. Why are they tubular? Because bees have a tongue. So the bee can stick its tongue down in the flower to get to the nectar. Okay, bees are active during the day. So these are day flowers, and so on. So you can see from this table that there are many kinds of floral syndromes that attract different kinds of pollinators. The original pollinators were actually beetles. And to this day, if you look at a magnolia flower, you're looking at one of the original angiosperm flowers. Beetles are kind of stupid, so you can't make it a complicated flower. You have to make it big and easy. You have to have it smelly so that they'll find it. Beetles cannot handle complicated flowers. They only fly during the day, and you simply need to make it easy for beetles to find the pollen. Beetles generally eat pollen. They don't generally eat nectar, so you're going to sacrifice some of your pollen to get pollinated. Question in class. Okay, can character displacement play a role in these characters? Well, yes, actually it can. Some plants will, in a particular family, will specialize on one type of pollinator or another. And one of the reasons why they might specialize on different pollinators is to reduce the potential for inappropriate pollen transfer. So if you can specialize, you can ensure greater specificity, but more of your pollen gets where you want it to go. Okay. So anyway, beetle flowers are like magnolia flowers. Big, open, simple cups, and mostly they don't have a lot of nectar, mostly they have pollen. Because pollen was the original reward for a pollinator. Birds, unlike insects, see red very well. So bird flowers tend to be reddish or orangish. They don't smell well, so they generally don't have any color, and they have a large tube, because what do birds have? They have long beaks. They can stick that beak down in that tube. They can use their tongue to go even further, and that will exclude things like insects if this plant doesn't want insects stealing its nectar. Okay. Butterflies are the only exception to the rule that insects see red poorly. Butterflies actually can see red and orange. And so some flowers that attract butterflies are in that color range. They look quite different from bird flowers, however. Butterflies are big and clumsy, so they need a landing platform. What's a landing platform for a butterfly that you might be familiar with? About lantana in your garden. Lantana has these heads of flowers that kind of stick up, and they form a landing pad. And lantana flowers are often yellow, red, orange, because they're attracting butterflies rather than other kinds of insects. They're tiny flowers, so they're not terribly interesting to most birds. Most birds like much bigger flowers. Question here. Okay, so the question is about who's doing the selecting on who. Is the pollinator primarily selecting the flower characteristics, or is the plant primarily selecting the pollinator characteristics? In fact, both can go on simultaneously. It can be this analogy to the Red Queen, where everybody's selecting simultaneously. However, there are some instances in which one of the partners does have an outsized effect on the other. Okay, so just to finish this up, fly-pollinated plants, of which there are many, 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 appeal to flies. Flies like stinky stuff. So often the color of a fly flower is dull or dark brown, suggesting something dead or stinky, and they have putrid smells. Okay. Before there were pollination syndromes, there was wind pollination. And so this predates the angiosperms. Conifers have wind pollination in general. So they have flowers in the form of cones, but they don't have an odor, they don't produce nectar, and they rely on wind to blow their pollen around. So prior to the evolution of pollination syndromes, wind was the primary way in which pollen was dispersed. Okay, well, let's give you some examples of what this looks like. Okay, I was saying that magnolias are the original beetle flowers. These are the original angiosperm flowers. And here it is. That's exactly a magnolia. That's what the original angiosperm flowers looked like. It was a big old bowl, and beetles were free to crawl all over it and get themselves dusted with pollen. Now, what was going on then? Well, it wasn't like magnolias wanted beetles. Magnolias were just trying to put their pollen out for the wind to take. But as it turns out, beetles are attracted to pollen because it's got lots of protein. So they ate the pollen. But in eating the pollen, they had to crawl all over these flowers. They had to dust themselves with pollen. And then they would fly to another flower and transfer some of that pollen. So what started out as an exploitation of magnolias by beetles turned into something that wound up being mutually beneficial. I want you to keep that in mind, because that's a theme that we're going to have throughout. Okay, here in the middle on the top is a typical bee flower. It's lovely blue, and notice that this looks much more complicated here. You've got these petals that are arranged in strange combinations. In fact, bees are the most intelligent of the insects, and they can solve puzzles. So they can be taught to press down on one of these petals to open up the inside of the flower so they can get the nectar. And because other insects are not as smart, they can't figure out how to do that. So the plant is quite specific for bees. Only bees can successfully pollinate flowers like these, and other kinds of pollinators are excluded. So smart bees with long tongues can get in there and get that nectar. Nobody else can figure out how to solve the puzzle. I mentioned that butterflies need a landing platform, and lantana provides a landing platform. This is a lantana plant right here. And notice you got all these tiny little flowers. They're red and yellow. And a butterfly can land on here and walk along this landing platform, sticking its tongue down in each of these flowers in turn, getting some pollen on itself while it does so. Here's your typical bird flower, and notice that it's way bigger than a lantana flower. And look at the angle. There's no way that a butterfly could land on this and cling on and get its tongue way down there. Its tongue is just too short. Okay. Here are a couple of bat flowers. This is a tropical plant that relies on bats flying up and sort of clinging on with their little claws. So it has to be a pretty tough, fleshy flower. And here's a cactus from the desert Southwest with a bat, showing you that it's going to stick its face in. The one thing we haven't shown you here is a moth-pollinated flower. Those are also white. They open at night. They're also tubular because moths have long tongues, but they're much smaller than these flowers that attract bats. Bats go for big plants, or big flowers, and moths go for small ones. Okay, dispersal mutualisms operate in much the same way as pollination systems do. Once again, the plants try to attract specific dispersers that will put their seeds in specific places. And the animals that are responding to this have characteristics that enable them to make use of the seeds or the fruits that surround the seeds. And not everybody can make use of every kind of fruit. So here you have some different kinds of animals that disperse the seeds of plants, hoarding animals like maybe squirrels, and hoarding birds like maybe blue jays, have actually similar kinds of seeds that they exploit. If a plant wants to attract these things, it's going to have brown or green fruits, no particular odor. It'll have tough, nuts, and the reward is the seed itself. So when a squirrel gets an acorn, it's got to gnaw through the tough wall to get at the seed. Well, the secret to this being a mutualism is that the squirrels then hide their acorns, and then they forget about some of them. Okay, they can't find them all, and some of them germinate in the places where they hid them. And the hoarding birds do much the same thing. We don't see them as much here as we do in the Western United States, but it's the same idea. They peck through these really tough seed coats to get the seed inside. They cache their seeds for later on, and then they forget about some of them. Okay, arboreal mammals like maybe primates can see color pretty well, so you can make your fruits a variety of colors. Because they are mammals, though, they always have a good sense of smell, and so they always smell good, like figs. And here are some technical terms for how we describe the fruits that something like a monkey might eat. But what's the reward? It's the sugary pulp, maybe with some protein in it. But what this plant is hoping for is that the monkey will eat the fruit, pass through the digestive system without digesting the seed, and then poop it out someplace appropriate. Okay, bats do a lot of dispersing, and they want fruits that look like those bat flowers, and they want an aroma that they can find. And once again, they are using the pulp surrounding the seeds rather than digesting the seeds themselves. So look, you've got the hoarders, which are after the seeds. And then a lot of these other dispersers are not interested in the seed at all. They're interested in the sweet pulp surrounding the seed, like the flesh of an apple, like the flesh of an orange. Okay, so terrestrial mammals will eat fallen fruits, and because they're mammals, they are, they have their own special abilities, and they're very similar to arboreal mammals and bats in some cases. Now, birds do a lot of dispersing, and some are obligate, like these guys, and they can see color very well. So they see these specific kinds of colors that mammals maybe don't see well. And some birds are less dependent on fruits, but basically they're looking for the same things. There is a dispersal syndrome that relies on passive transfer. Okay, so that's the hook kind of seeds that you get in your socks, or maybe unfortunately get in your hair if you're out in the fields wandering around and you have to come home and then pick that stuff all out. Well, that's designed to stick in the hair or feathers of animals and be transported long distances until the feather falls out or until the hair is shed. And that's long distance dispersal to someplace way far away. Finally, ants do a lot of dispersal, and that's primarily in the understory of the temperate forests, like Ohio or like the European forests. They have specialized structures that attract them to the seeds that they're going to disperse. They do have an odor, but that odor is only perceptible to ants. It's generally kind of an oily odor. And we call this special structure that's stuck onto an ant dispersed seed an elaiosome. Okay, so what they do then is they pick up that elaiosome, they take it back to the nest, they chew it off, they consume the elaiosome and share it with the other nestmates, and then they take the seeds and dispose of them in an empty chamber in the ant nest. And then they just sort of forget about it. And when the ants leave the nest at the end of the year, well, they have a whole bunch of seeds cached there in a pretty favorable environment. Lots of dead ants, lots of waste products full of nitrogen for the seeds to make use of. So once again, here are some of those dispersal things. Here is the passive fur or feather clasping kind of syndrome. And of course, none of you would want to get that in your socks because it'd be a real pain to get out. But that's what it's designed for. It's designed to be a pain. It's designed to stick the feathers or fur for a long time until it's dispersed somewhere far away. Here's your hoarding mammal or hoarding bird type seed. It's got a really tough coat that they have to gnaw through or peck through to get the seed inside. So that's like acorns. Here's a typical frugivorous bird looking for a really sweet treat. There are tiny, tiny seeds inside here. They will pass quickly through the bird's digestive system. The seeds will not be digested. The pulp will. And then it'll poop it out somewhere. Here's a monkey looking for figs in the tropical rainforest. And you can see that the figs do much the same thing as these things do, but these figs are not bright red. The primates can certainly see colors, but this is really for birds. This is a typical primate fruit. And then here's a piper fruit that a bat is eating. Okay, and it doesn't look like much, but it smells pretty strong to a nocturnal mammal. So once again, the traits of the plants and the traits of the mammals or birds or whatever converge into something that confers some specificity. Because these bat fruits are not brightly colored, neither primates nor birds tend to see them. Because they do smell, the birds cannot detect them. The primates are asleep when these things are putting out their odor. So the specificity is what's important here. Now, dispersal then has a special consequence, which is that there tends to be an optimal dispersal distance. And there is a dispersal distance because of a couple of things that are going on. First off, if seeds simply fall straight down below the parent tree, then you're likely to get a lot of seeds, but you're also likely to get a lot of predators, parasites, and diseases attracted to those seeds because they're in a gigantic patch. And what is the parent tree? The parent tree is a red flag to predators, parasites, and diseases saying, hey, I'm this species. You can find a whole bunch of things that are good to eat right under me. So even though seed fall is very heavy under a parent tree, virtually no seeds survive. That's the importance of dispersal. Dispersal removes the seeds from the danger of being too close to a big parent that's waving a red flag saying, come and eat my seeds. Okay, and so the dispersal pattern of seeds then falls off very sharply as you get away from a parent plant. But the survival then increases very sharply as you get away from that parent plant. Okay, and seeds that are dispersed a long distance have really good survival, but there are very few of them. Seeds that are dispersed an intermediate distance have better survival than under the parent, and more of them get dispersed. So there's going to be a recruitment peak at some point where these lines cross, where you get large amounts of dispersal, or large amounts of dispersal here, and pretty good survival. Survival is great out here, but so few seeds get dispersed that far that you don't get a lot of new plants out there. There are tons of seeds here, but almost every single one of them is going to die. So you don't get any recruitment here. Recruitment tends to peak at some intermediate distance between 0 and infinity for every species, and the particular characteristics of each species determine how far away from the parent plant that recruitment peak is going to wind up being. Okay. But this was due to someone who we will encounter again in this course, and that's Dan Jansen. I had the pleasure of doing my dissertation in the same location where Dan Jansen was doing his field work. He was a really cantankerous person who did not suffer fools and said many things to me which I won't repeat because that's just the way he was. Okay. Okay, last then kind of mutualism we'll talk about today is protection mutualism. And the classic protection mutualism is that of ants and acacias. So in the tropical rainforest, you frequently find these little trees and there's nothing growing around them. And they're just all in the middle of a little clearing in the middle of the rainforest, which looks so weird. Why is there this clearing? Because these plants are hosting ants. And the ants will go down and bite and sting plants that are trying to germinate close to their host plant. So why do the ants like this plant? Because it provides them with resources. It provides them with protein and lipid-rich bodies at the ends of the leaves called belchant bodies. It provides them with nectar in what we call extrafloral nectaries here. So they have protein, they have lipids, they have carbohydrate food. What else would an ant need? Well, one thing an ant needs is a place to live. And so the thorns of these plants are expanded and pulpy, and the ants can just chew right through and make a little ant chamber inside these hollow thorns. And if you have any doubt that protection is important to these plants, here's proof. This is a study from, let's see, which is this one? This is, I can't remember. Oh, this is acacias. Okay, this is acacias. So if you dust the acacia with pesticides to kill the ants, this is what happens to the acacia over the next few months. Basically, most of them die. Okay, and that's even though the pesticide will kill the herbivores. The herbivores come right back and they just eat that acacia down to the ground. But if you have control acacias that you dust with talcum powder that just annoy the ants, then the survival of the acacias is really good. So the ants are, in fact, protecting the acacia in exchange for goods and services like food and shelter. It's actually quite common. There's many such mutualisms in the tropics, especially. This is one that a friend of mine from graduate school, Gene Shoup, did. And basically, he took some cecropia trees that were relatively small, and he did the same experiment. He dusted them with pesticides to remove the ants, and noticed that over a 2-year period, more or less, they didn't really grow very well. But if he dusted them with talcum powder, then they grew from about 2.5 meters to about 5 meters in size. So they were really benefiting from the ants. This is something that happens in the tropics very, very frequently, not so much in the temperate zone. So protection mutualisms are predominantly tropical, but pollination and dispersal are pretty universal. And that is all we've got to say for today. Okay. As a reminder, this will not be on the exam on Monday, so you don't have to worry about that. And if you have questions about material that might be on the exam on Monday, please feel free to ask. You can come by office hours, you can come by the lab today, or you can just email me over the weekend and ask for a Zoom if you'd like. So unless we have questions in class, unless we have questions at home, we are done for the day. All right. We'll see you all later.